The year is 1910, and in the quiet woods of Olalla, Washington, a strange building looms against the fog. Locals whisper about it in hushed tones. They call it a sanitarium, but to others, it was something far darker. Inside, the air is heavy, still, suffocating. The halls are lined with the sound of shallow breathing, patients lying in narrow beds, their bodies nothing but skin stretched tightly over bone. Faces hollowed, eyes wide and sunken, lips cracked from thirst. These were men and women who had once come seeking health, vitality, and life. But instead, many found only death. At the center of it all was a woman with piercing eyes and an unshakable belief in her own methods. Linda Burfield Hazzard. She called herself a doctor, though she never held a medical degree. Her cure? A radical and brutal treatment she insisted could purge the body of all disease, starvation. She promised to heal any ailment, to restore youth, to bring balance to the body. And in the early 1900s, desperate patients, some wealthy, some vulnerable, placed their faith, their fortunes, and ultimately their lives in her hands. Some never walked out of her clinic alive. And yet the mystery lingers. Was Linda Hazzard a true believer, a fanatic blinded by her obsession with starvation therapy? Or was she a cunning predator, a con woman who enjoyed the power she held over life and death? Her story is one of medicine gone wrong, of blind faith, and of lives destroyed in the name of healing. It is the story of how one woman, under the guise of care, built a house of suffering in the Washington wilderness. Welcome to Historical Serial Killers, where we uncover the darkest corners of history. Tell me in the comments, from where in the world are you watching, and what time is it right now? We begin with the chilling tale of a midwife-turned-monster, Linda Hazzard, the Starvation Doctor. Tell us in the comment from where you are watching the Historical Serial Killers documentary and what time it is there. Before she became known as the Starvation Doctor, Linda Hazzard was simply Linda Laura Burfield, born in Carver County, Minnesota in 1867. The post-Civil War era was a time of sweeping change in America. Modern medicine was still in its infancy, and many communities, especially rural ones, had limited access to trained physicians. In such an environment, alternative remedies and folk cures thrived. From an early age, Linda developed an almost obsessive fascination with the human body and unconventional healing. While other children played, she was drawn to books and discussions about health, longevity, and the strange new theories emerging at the time. But unlike traditional doctors who went through years of schooling, Linda charted her own course. She never earned a medical degree. She never formally trained in a university. Yet she burned with ambition. Ambition not just to practice medicine, but to be seen as an authority, a pioneer, someone who could bend life and death to her will. By the time she reached adulthood, she had already begun experimenting with fasting therapy, a radical idea that claimed the body could heal itself if toxins were purged through abstaining from food. To Linda, fasting wasn't just a treatment, it was a philosophy, a near-religious belief that starvation was nature's ultimate cure. But life outside her obsession was turbulent. Linda's first marriage ended in scandal, and she eventually remarried a man named Samuel Hazzard, a former Army officer with his own share of troubles. Samuel was known to be a drifter, plagued by debts and accusations of forgery. Together, Linda and Samuel became a formidable, if dubious, pair. A woman who claimed healing powers, and a man willing to help her navigate the law and finance her ambitions. It was Samuel who eventually supported Linda's move west, to the rugged and rapidly developing state of Washington. Here, the couple found fertile ground for their plans. Washington's laws at the time contained loopholes that allowed practitioners of alternative medicine to obtain licenses without formal medical degrees. Linda exploited this with precision, eventually securing a license to practice as a fasting specialist. Now, she could legally call herself a doctor. But context is everything. At the dawn of the 20th century, society was captivated by the promise of alternative medicine. Conventional treatments often seemed just as dangerous as the illnesses they tried to cure. Mercury-laced tonics, bloodletting, crude surgeries without anesthesia. Many people, especially the wealthy, turned to natural healers who promised gentler, more holistic cures. Linda positioned herself perfectly within this movement. She cultivated an image of wisdom, authority, and confidence. She spoke with certainty, often quoting her own writings and lectures on the healing powers of fasting. And for those desperate for relief from chronic pain, from depression, from illnesses doctors couldn't fix, her conviction was intoxicating. By the early 1900s, Linda had begun to attract patients. Some were drawn to her charisma, others to her promises of miraculous cures. And yet, behind her reassuring voice and steely gaze, there was already a darker side emerging. Patients under her care grew weak, frail, and in some cases, never recovered. But Linda had explanations for everything. To her followers, she claimed that death was not failure but a result of the body being too far gone to begin with. To skeptics, she presented herself as a misunderstood pioneer, unfairly maligned by those clinging to outdated medical traditions. Step by step, she was building her reputation and preparing for something far greater, her own clinic in the wilderness of Washington, a place where she would have full control over her patients, their treatments, and their fates. And in that isolated clinic, Linda Hazzard's beliefs would no longer be theoretical. They would become practice, a practice that left behind a trail of skeletal bodies and broken lives. But what exactly was this doctrine she preached? And how could she convince so many to believe in something so dangerous? To understand Linda Hazzard, we must first understand the doctrine she lived by and forced upon others. At its core, her philosophy was deceptively simple. The human body was poisoned by toxins, and the only way to purge them was through prolonged fasting. To Linda, food was not nourishment. It was the very cause of disease. She insisted that everything from headaches to cancer, from depression to arthritis, stemmed from the same root, an overloaded toxic system. Her solution? Starvation. Hazzard claimed that when the body was deprived of food, it would begin to consume its own impurities. She argued that fasting wasn't killing her patients, it was healing them, cleansing them, purifying them from within. It sounded revolutionary, especially at a time when modern medicine still relied on questionable methods. Traditional doctors were cutting into bodies without proper sterilization, prescribing opiates liberally, or dosing patients with mercury-based compounds. Against this backdrop, Linda's approach felt natural, holistic, even spiritual. But science tells a very different story. Yes, short-term fasting can trigger processes that temporarily help the body rest and repair. But prolonged starvation, days turning into weeks, strips the body of essential nutrients. The body consumes fat reserves, then muscle, and eventually even organ tissue in a desperate attempt to survive. Immune systems collapse, the heart weakens. Hallucinations, organ failure, and death soon follow. Yet Linda dismissed these warning signs as healing crises, proof in her mind that the treatment was working. If a patient grew weak, vomited bile, or fainted from hunger, Linda would reassure them that the toxins were leaving their system. If they lingered on the edge of death, she insisted they were simply not fasting long enough. And so, patients endured. Linda's clinic in Olalla, Washington, was built to serve as both a retreat and a testing ground for her beliefs. Nestled among tall evergreens, the place looked serene from the outside, more like a rustic lodge than a hospital. To those who arrived, it promised peace, quiet, and healing away from the chaos of city life. But once inside, reality was far from idyllic. Patients were placed on strict diets that amounted to near starvation. A few spoonfuls of strained broth, perhaps a small piece of tomato or orange once in a while. Days stretched into weeks under this regime. Some were instructed to walk long distances despite their frailty, or subjected to daily enemas and harsh massages meant to aid the cleansing process. And as bodies withered away, suspicions began to grow. Neighbors noticed that not all patients who entered Linda's sanitarium ever came out again. The sight of skeletal figures stumbling through town became common. Funerals followed. Yet somehow Linda's reputation continued to draw new clients. Why? Because Linda was not just a practitioner, she was a saleswoman of hope. She spoke with conviction, dressed with authority, and carried herself as a woman who had uncovered a secret that the rest of the medical establishment refused to accept. In lectures and in her own writings, she declared that fasting could cure anything. She promised results. And to the desperate, those suffering illnesses conventional medicine couldn't touch, or the wealthy elite looking for eternal youth, her words were irresistible. They wanted to believe. But behind the promises, a darker pattern was emerging. Patients grew so weak they could no longer write letters home. Some signed over property, jewels and bank accounts to Linda and Samuel. And when they died, their deaths were brushed off as the inevitable outcome of pre-existing disease. Each case was explained away, each body another failure of nature, never of her treatment. And so the doctrine of starvation spread, pulling more and more lives into its grip. But the truth would not stay hidden forever. Because in time, stories of horrific suffering and mysterious disappearances would begin to surface. And soon, the world would learn the name Linda Hazzard in the most chilling way possible. For years, Linda Hazzard's sanitarium in Olalla drew in patients from all walks of life, but especially those with wealth and status. They arrived with hope, carrying suitcases and faith in her promise of healing. But many would leave in caskets if they left at all. The most infamous of her cases involved two young sisters from Britain, Claire and Dora Williamson. They were wealthy, cultured, and deeply interested in alternative therapies. In 1912, while traveling in Canada, they came across Linda Hazzard's book, Fasting for the Cure of Disease. Enthralled by her claims, they decided to journey to Washington State to undergo the treatment themselves. When they first arrived at Hazzard's clinic, they were healthy, vibrant, and full of life. But within weeks, they had become unrecognizable. Linda's strict regimen reduced them to shadows of their former selves. They were fed tiny amounts of broth, given enemas, and subjected to long, draining walks despite their failing strength. Their bodies began to collapse under the strain. Claire, the elder of the two, did not survive. Her official cause of death was listed as cirrhosis of the liver, but witnesses knew better. Her body was emaciated, her weight reduced to almost nothing. Meanwhile, Dora hovered near death, skeletal and delirious. But what made the Williamson case so shocking wasn't just the starvation. It was what came after. During their stay, Linda and her husband Samuel had gained access to the sisters' finances. Jewelry vanished, bank accounts were drained, legal documents were signed while the sisters were too weak to resist. In the end, Dora survived only because friends and family intervened. She was rescued from the clinic, barely alive, and her testimony would become the cornerstone of the case against Linda Hazzard. Yet the Williamsons were far from her only victims. Locals whispered about others, patients who came to Olalla seeking a cure, only to disappear. Among them was Eugene Wakelin, a man who entrusted his health to Linda and ended up dead. His estate was curiously altered in her favor before his passing. Then there was Ida Wilcox, who arrived full of hope but left only as another name on a growing list of unexplained deaths. Neighbors grew suspicious. They saw patients, skeletal and hollow-eyed, shuffling weakly through the woods or down the dirt roads. Some were so emaciated they could hardly stand. When one died, Linda would often arrange the funeral herself, ensuring she maintained control over the narrative. Families were told their loved ones had succumbed to natural causes, disease too advanced to cure. But the pattern was clear. Testimonies from survivors described a regime that bordered on torture. Patients were locked in rooms, sometimes denied even the smallest portion of broth. They were lectured, scolded, told their suffering was proof of healing. Some endured relentless treatments of daily enemas and brutal massages that left them bruised and weakened. One survivor recalled how Linda would stand over patients, eyes fixed and unyielding, declaring, "Your body is fighting the cure. Endure and you will be healed." Endure. But endurance only led to the grave. And then there was the matter of the bodies. Accounts from Olalla tell of skeletal corpses, their bones pressing through parchment-thin skin. When outsiders caught glimpses of these dead or near-dead patients, the horror was undeniable. This was no healing retreat. It was a house of suffering. For years, authorities seemed hesitant to act. Alternative medicine was popular, and many still respected Linda as a pioneer. Those who questioned her often faced ridicule, accused of clinging to outdated medical traditions. And for every death, Linda had an explanation: pre-existing illness, natural decline, or the patient's failure to commit fully to the treatment. But whispers turned into outrage as the body count rose. It became impossible to ignore the growing number of funerals, the grieving families, the estates that curiously ended up under Linda's control. And the Williamson sisters' ordeal finally brought everything to light. Claire's death was too suspicious, Dora's survival too damning. Wealthy and well-connected, their family had the means to demand answers. Investigators were hired, journalists caught wind of the story, and soon the world knew of the so-called Starvation Doctor. Her clinic was no longer a mysterious retreat in the woods. It was exposed as a death trap, a place where faith in an untested cure became a sentence of slow, deliberate suffering. And the stage was set for a courtroom drama that would shock not only Washington, but the entire nation. Because for the first time, Linda Hazzard would face justice for the lives lost under her watch. By 1912, the name Linda Hazzard was whispered with fear across Olalla and beyond. But it was the death of Claire Williamson and the miraculous survival of her sister Dora that finally brought the Starvation Doctor into the harsh light of the law. The Williamson sisters had come from privilege. Their family's fortune gave them both opportunity and vulnerability. Linda understood this. While her patients wasted away under her treatment, she and her husband Samuel quietly positioned themselves as advisors to the sisters, seizing control of their jewels, their bank accounts, even legal authority over their estates. By the time Claire lay dying, Linda already had access to much of their wealth. But Dora's survival changed everything. Barely able to speak, her voice no more than a whisper, Dora testified that she and her sister had been systematically starved, denied proper food, and manipulated into signing away their possessions. Her testimony shocked even those who had long doubted Linda's methods. Here was not rumor or suspicion, but living proof of deliberate abuse. The case quickly drew public attention. Newspapers splashed headlines across the front pages. The Starvation Doctor on trial. Mystery deaths at Olalla Sanitarium. The press painted Linda as a grim figure, a gaunt woman with sharp features and piercing eyes, who spoke with unshakable confidence even as the accusations piled high. To her critics, she was a murderer in disguise. To her defenders, she remained a visionary, persecuted for challenging traditional medicine. Inside the courtroom, the drama unfolded like a play. Witness after witness took the stand, recounting stories of loved ones who had died under Linda's care. Some described patients so thin their bones seemed ready to break through their skin. Others spoke of valuables that mysteriously disappeared once treatment began. The most powerful testimony, however, came from Dora herself. Fragile and weakened, she described the slow torture she and her sister endured. The endless fasting, the cruel massages, the days of delirium. Her words painted a haunting picture of a clinic where life drained away in silence, cloaked under the guise of healing. Linda's defense was as audacious as her practice. She insisted that her patients had come to her willingly, that they understood the risks of fasting, and that many of them were already gravely ill. Death, she claimed, was inevitable in some cases, a tragedy of timing, not malpractice. She positioned herself as a martyr of medical innovation, claiming the establishment sought to silence her revolutionary cures. Her attorney argued passionately that the sisters were adults, free to choose their treatment, and that Linda could not be held responsible for their fate. But the evidence told another story. Bank ledgers revealed financial exploitation. Autopsy reports described the shocking emaciation of Claire Williamson's body, and Dora's testimony remained a chilling reminder of what Linda's so-called healing truly looked like. After weeks of arguments, the jury returned its verdict: guilty of manslaughter. Not murder, the charge many had hoped for, but it was enough to see Linda sentenced to 2 to 20 years in prison. The sentence was hailed as a victory, though some felt justice had fallen short. Dozens had died under Linda's care, and yet she was being punished for only one. Still, for the first time, the woman who had cloaked herself in the authority of a doctor was forced to reckon with the consequences of her doctrine. The public followed the trial with morbid fascination. Editorials debated whether Linda was a cold-blooded fraud, deliberately preying on the wealthy, or a misguided zealot, so blinded by her own fanaticism that she could not see the suffering she caused. But whatever the interpretation, one truth was undeniable: her reign of unchecked authority had been interrupted. Yet the story of Linda Hazzard does not end in that courtroom. Because unlike many convicted killers, she did not spend her life behind bars. Through political influence, manipulation, and sheer audacity, she would walk free again. And when she did, she returned not humbled, not changed, but more determined than ever to prove that starvation was the cure for all disease. In 1912, Linda Hazzard entered the Washington State Penitentiary to begin her sentence. Officially, she had been given a term of 2 to 20 years for manslaughter in the death of Claire Williamson. Many believed this would be the end of the so-called Starvation Doctor. But even behind bars, Linda was far from powerless. Prison reports described her as confident, composed, and utterly unrepentant. She spoke at length about the righteousness of her methods, insisting that history would vindicate her. To fellow inmates, she was not a criminal, but a visionary, wrongfully persecuted for daring to challenge the medical establishment. And Linda's influence extended far beyond the prison walls. Her husband Samuel worked tirelessly to campaign for her release, appealing to anyone who would listen. Supporters of alternative medicine rallied to her cause, arguing that she was a victim of a corrupt system, silenced for daring to heal without drugs or surgery. It worked. After serving just 2 years, Linda was granted parole in 1915. She returned to her husband, her beliefs entirely intact, and with an even greater determination to prove herself. Most people, after a prison sentence, would fade into obscurity. But Linda Hazzard was not most people. Almost immediately, she began writing, lecturing, and planning her next chapter. She published articles defending the value of fasting, portraying herself as a misunderstood pioneer. And astonishingly, she still had followers. For some, her conviction only increased her mystique. They saw her as a martyr, a woman punished for daring to speak the truth. Others, still desperate for cures that conventional medicine could not provide, were willing to risk everything to place themselves under her care. And Linda gave them that chance. She resumed practicing, this time outside the official framework of her sanitarium, offering fasting cures privately, and later reopening facilities in different forms. Patients continued to die, though not always under circumstances that attracted as much public scrutiny as the Williamson case. Some deaths went unreported, others brushed aside. Her most loyal patients defended her fiercely, claiming they felt better, lighter, purified by her methods. They dismissed the deaths as tragic coincidences. To them, Linda was not a fraud, but a healer with rare insight into the body's mysteries. But for those who dared to look closer, the reality was unmistakable. Linda Hazzard had not changed. She was still prescribing starvation, still guiding people into frailty and death, and still benefiting financially from their devotion. Even her time in prison had not broken her conviction. If anything, it had hardened it. The state seemed reluctant to intervene again. Perhaps the embarrassment of the Williamson case made officials wary. Perhaps it was the persistence of Linda's supporters, who painted her as a target of professional jealousy. Whatever the reason, Linda Hazzard slipped back into her role, operating in the margins, continuing to attract patients, and continuing to bury them. In time, her name faded from headlines, but not from the lips of those who still whispered about the sanitarium in Olalla. The building stood as a grim reminder of what had happened there. Lives wasted away, fortunes drained, hope turned to ash. Yet Linda's story wasn't over. She would practice for decades more, her reputation swinging between healer and monster, saint and fraud. And in the strangest twist of all, she would one day turn her doctrine inward, using her own fasting cure on herself. And when she did, the result would be fatal. By the 1930s, Linda Hazzard was no longer the headline-grabbing villain of Washington State, but she had never abandoned her doctrine. Decades after her trial, she continued to promote fasting as the cure for virtually every ailment. Her supporters remained loyal, her detractors wary but tired. In a world still experimenting with medicine, Where antibiotics were only just beginning to change the landscape of healthcare, Linda clung stubbornly to her beliefs. She lectured, she treated patients, and she carried herself as if her conviction had never been shaken. But the years wore her down. Her sanitarium in Olalla, the place that had once been filled with whispers, prayers, and the slow fading breaths of patience, was eventually destroyed in a fire. The ruin stood as a haunting reminder of all that had transpired within its walls. Still, Linda pressed on. In 1938, she made a decision that would seal her fate. Feeling unwell, she chose not to consult conventional doctors. Instead, she turned once more to the cure she had championed her entire life: fasting. For weeks, she refused nourishment, applying the same harsh regime she had inflicted on countless others. The woman who had demanded her patients endure was now enduring the same slow collapse of her own body. Her health spiraled downward. Just as with her victims, her flesh wasted away, her strength ebbed, her organs weakened. And finally, Linda Hazzard died as she had lived, in the grip of starvation. The irony was almost poetic, though far too grim to inspire satisfaction. To some, her death proved her fanaticism. To others, it was the final evidence of her delusion. She had not wavered until the end. But what was she truly? To her patients who survived, Linda was remembered as a tormentor, a woman whose treatments left scars, both physical and emotional. Families mourned loved ones who had entered her care hopeful and left in coffins. To the courts, she was a criminal who had escaped with too light a sentence. And yet, among a small circle of loyal followers, Linda was mourned as a misunderstood genius, silenced by an unkind world that never appreciated her discovery. These voices argued that she had been right all along, that mainstream medicine had conspired against her. But history has not been kind to Linda Hazzard. Today, medical experts recognize her work for what it was: dangerous quackery rooted in obsession, not science. Her doctrine ignored basic biology, twisting temporary effects of fasting into a universal cure and disregarding the very real dangers of malnutrition. Psychologists studying her case often ask, was she a true believer, blinded by her own fanaticism, or a predator hiding behind the mask of medicine? The answer is elusive. Some evidence suggests she was utterly convinced of her own theories, unable, or unwilling, to see the devastation they caused. Others point to the financial exploitation of her patients, the jewels and estates that flowed into her possession, as proof of calculated manipulation. Perhaps she was both, a woman who believed just enough in her own lies to sell them convincingly, while exploiting those who trusted her. Whatever the truth, her legacy is written in the lives she destroyed. Dozens of patients, lured by hope, lost everything in her care. Her name endures not as a pioneer of healing, but as a cautionary tale of what happens when conviction eclipses compassion, when charisma blinds the desperate, and when belief turns lethal. The story of Linda Hazzard is not just the tale of one woman's obsession. It is the story of how desperation, charisma, and misplaced trust can turn healing into horror. Her sanitarium in Olalla promised peace, purity, and renewal. Instead, it became a place of slow suffering, where hope starved alongside the body. Wealthy heirs, widows, travelers, and dreamers came to her doors, seeking life. Many found only death. The case of the Williamson sisters exposed her methods to the world. The trial painted her as both predator and zealot. Prison interrupted her reign, but it did not stop her. Even after serving her sentence, she returned to fasting therapy, convinced of its power, unbroken by scandal or shame. And in a final twist of irony, she died in the same way so many of her patients had, starved in the name of health. But the question remains, who was Linda Hazzard truly? Was she a delusional fanatic, so consumed by her belief in fasting that she could not see the destruction it caused? Or was she a calculating manipulator, a con woman who preyed on the vulnerable and enriched herself from their suffering? Perhaps she was both. What is certain is the devastation she left behind. Families torn apart, fortunes stolen, lives wasted away under the promise of a cure that never existed. Her story stands as a chilling reminder of the dangers of blind faith, in untested medicine, in charismatic figures, in promises that sound too good to be true. It is a warning that echoes even now, in a world still filled with miracle cures and self-proclaimed healers. And it is a testament to the resilience of those who survived, like Dora Williamson, who found the strength to testify, to speak the truth when her body was nearly broken. Without her voice, Linda Hazzard might never have faced justice at all. In the end, Linda Hazzard wore the mask of a healer. But behind that mask was something far darker. A woman who claimed to cure, but who left a trail of death in her wake. A monster in disguise. This was Historical Serial Killers. Thank you for watching. If you found this story haunting, share your thoughts below. Would you have trusted Linda's cure back in 1910, when medicine itself was so uncertain? And if you're new here, consider subscribing for more stories from the darkest corners of history. Until next time, stay curious, stay safe, and remember, not every healer wears white.